Hey everybody, want to welcome you to the Deeper Dive podcast of Hopevale Church. This is where we take the conversation that was started in the message from the weekend and we keep it going throughout the week. My name is Paul Miller. I am not Dan Davis or Kathy Davis. Dan and Kathy are out of town this week, so I am sitting in for them, and I am joined today by Adam Harbaugh and Nate Murray. And it was an interesting weekend because we did kind of a new thing, right? We had live teaching at both of our campuses. So I had to do twice the homework, right? I had to listen to both messages to get ready for this conversation today. And I couldn't help but notice that both of you guys referenced Star Wars.
I did. I said, you got to throw little Easter eggs out there because Easter's coming, right?
That's right.
What a dad joke.
It is a total dad joke. And you, Adam, I don't know how many times you said this is the way or what is the way or whatever. And I know that Nate, you and Moses are big Mandalorian fans.
Absolutely, yeah.
This is the way.
Yeah, so I thought that was interesting. But here's my question. How did you guys coordinate your message prep? I know it was like same passage, same series, one church, right? Multiple locations. So you both went in the same direction, but with different emphasis is how I would describe it. Yeah. How did you guys work together? Give us a little peek behind the scenes, how you prepared for this last Sunday.
Yeah, so obviously we had the same passage, and then we kind of together worked on landing on a bottom line statement that we were both working off of, and then a common title as well. And then from there, I think we just kind of went to our separate study rooms and dove into the scripture. And we did kind of come at it from a couple different ways, but ultimately just that same bottom line that this is a spirit-led life, empowers us to love well.
And to walk by the Spirit. I'm noticing your Marquette, Michigan t-shirt, which fits in perfectly with your story.
Unplanned.
Yeah, Nate, from the weekend. And so the cool thing is, for those of you that are listening to this podcast and you want to take a deeper dive, all you have to do is go back and listen to whichever message you didn't hear yet. That's right. From the weekend, and you should be good to go. But both of you asked kind of icebreaker questions at the beginning of your message. And so I thought a good way to start our conversation today would be to ask you the other guy's question, right? And so, Adam, I'm going to start with you. Okay. Nate in his message asked, when have you felt, what's a time when you have felt empowered in your life? So we'll just jump right in on the deep side.
No, that is deep. That would be one that I would have to put some thought into.
You're not allowed to.
I know. So just spur of the moment, answer the question. Honestly, when I feel most empowered, I think it's, when you look at and you study scripture and you kind of take the marching orders from that. And I think that really ties into the message, because if I'm left to my own devices and my own perspective on things, like I could empower myself in any different way and method that I want, because I've told myself that I'm allowed to be empowered however I want. But I know that left to my own devices, I'm not going to end up in the best places. And so when I get, my marching orders from scripture and I get to feel empowered by a source that I trust, that is outside of myself, that's when I feel confident about, hey, this is like trustworthy and true. I can take this to the bank and, refer to it as the reason that I'm empowered to live in whatever way that I'm living, right?
That's cool. So it's if the ground under your feet is stable, right?
Yeah.
Then you feel empowered to lean in. That's actually really cool. Nate's comment was that the Spirit enables us to receive, not achieve, love and acceptance, which I think empowers us to do things like jump off rocks into the freezing cold water or whatever it might be. Okay, Nate, here was Adam's opener question. How can I love well when I am so conflicted over what's happening in the world today? Adam talked about different ways that the church sometimes responds to things going on in the culture, like we'll build really big walls to keep the bad people out, or we'll go to war with the culture, or we'll assimilate and become just like the culture. So how do we love well when we're so conflicted over what's happening in the world? Yeah. Another light question to start our conversation today.
Yeah, that's really, really good. That's a good question, Adam.
My hope was that it
Kudos to
resonated
you.
with everybody, right?
Oh man, I would have just sat there listening. I mean, thinking about the answer to that the whole time. I think there's so many crazy things going on in our world. I remember one of the conferences that we listened to. There was back when the pandemic first started. One of the speakers made mention of, what if this is as easy as it's going to ever be,
Right.
for us as the church to be who we are, if it's only going to get more complicated. And then it got more complicated. But I think you have to remember what's actually true. And you've got to ground yourself in what Scripture teaches us, what the Spirit obviously empowers us with and reminds us of, because those things don't change. So whatever the circumstances are that are changing, and however chaotic they may get, they're always going to cause feelings in us. And you can't dictate your choices based on those feelings. You have to dictate them on what's true instead. So I think that's the key, is first of all, knowing what's true, and then finding ways to remind yourself of what's true. That way, that becomes the cornerstone or the level ground that you stand on when everything else gets crazy.
That's really, really good. Yeah. And really, the lion's share of the message yesterday was doing exactly that from Galatians 5, right? Both you guys talked about the tension between walking by the Spirit instead of giving in to the desires of your flesh. And Galatians 5:17, for the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you are not to do whatever you want. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Okay, so that's a loaded statement from the Apostle Paul there. And as I was listening to you guys' messages, I wrote down, there were a number of things that each of you said that kind of caught my attention. And I'm not sure I agree with all of them. So I just want to throw them out there and let you guys talk about it, right? So Adam, you talked about the fact that the conflict is in me, in us, right? Yeah. It's our sinful nature, our flesh, versus the Spirit of God who is in us. Talk more about that.
Yeah, so first of all, when that passage that you just read gets translated, that last line does have a tendency to get translated in a couple of different ways. And so just to put it on the table, Nate and I actually referred to two different kind of versions of how that last line is captured. And so mine was actually that they are in conflict with each other so that you do not do what you want, right? And that is contrasted by, what was yours again?
The ESV says they are in conflict with each other so that you are not to do whatever you want.
Yes. And so there's a little bit of a distinction in there between the two things that is kind of captured there, but ultimately it comes down to it's almost like, are we going to come at it from the assumption that I'm desiring to be led by the Spirit so that you don't do whatever you want? Or I would almost argue on that one, they're coming at it from the standpoint of the flesh. We're like, hey, you're not going to do whatever you feel led to do in your own spirit, in your own sinful.
So the assumption there is that what I want to do is give into the flesh.
Yeah, what you, by that version, want to do is give into the flesh. And by this one, it's so that you do not do what you want. And what you want is to be hopefully led by the Spirit. At least that's how I read it and took it. But ultimately for me, this passage just captures and points out the internal conflict that we do feel between the sinful nature that is in everybody. And then for followers of Jesus, you've been given the gift of the Holy Spirit who lives inside of you. And those two things are in conflict with each other. And when you look at the world around you, so much of what we have seen, I think the way I put it was it's the internal conflict. We take the internal conflict and we inflict it externally onto someone or something else, and that really creates that you're my enemy, it's me versus you, it's right versus wrong, and all of that. And really a lot of damage and destruction comes when that's the attitude that we take, rather than viewing, hey, this is my internal conflict and I can either feed the sinful nature or be led by the Spirit.
Yeah, so I like that kinda.
Right. What don't you like about it?
Well, Nate, I'm going to go right to what Nate said. Nate said you said the Spirit and the flesh are incompatible, right? my experience is that I have both of those things inside me, and one wins. Sometimes one wins and sometimes the other wins. Forgive me for being really crass about that.
Right.
Right. But if they're incompatible, then I'm doomed to a life of like internal strife. Right. Is that logical conclusion of that?
This is the deeper dive. How deep do we want to go?
I know.
Yeah.
So I went on this really deep dive into the Judaizers. And man, when you start getting into that, like Paul references them several times and has very, very harsh things to say to them. Dan referenced it, that they would just emasculate themselves because for them circumcision was a really big issue.
Yeah.
So I ended up doing a deep dive on like why were the Judaizers doing what they were doing, and they were afraid. They were scared. So part of what Paul's addressing is you have this group coming in that are overcomplicating things for these new believers in Galatia. Mm-hmm. And they were following Paul around everywhere that he went. And their primary purpose was they were afraid of the persecution from Jewish non-believers who, when they saw the impact of faith in Jesus, they were lashing out against it. As people came to faith in Jesus, there was a transformation that took place in them, and suddenly they cared a lot less about external things than they used to, and it was causing this kind of cultural transformation to take place as people came to faith. Well, the Jewish people that were not placing faith in Christ didn't like what they saw, so some of the harshest persecution that the early church experienced was from Jewish non-believers.
Yeah.
So the Judaizers were trying to counteract that by following Paul around and saying, this doesn't have to be as transformational as you think. And even if you're going to put faith in Jesus, you still need to follow all these other things and some specific things, really, so that they could turn back to the Jewish non-believers and say, look, you don't have to be upset. We're still teaching people they need to become Jewish before they even become Christian. They need to follow all these traditions. And so part of what he's talking about, he's trying to reinforce for people, the Spirit is what leads you. You cannot accomplish your own salvation. Yeah. And even the working out of it, even your sanctification is something driven by the Spirit. And so there is this conflict that exists within us. But what I think he was trying to take them back to was there is power in the Spirit, and you don't need all this other stuff. All this other stuff that other people are trying to overcomplicate your walk with, both the flesh, the power of the flesh, and the law, which is why he references it. These are all man's attempts apart from God to meet their own needs and satisfy God's requirements. So the Spirit in you is more powerful than either of those things. And that's when he's talking about that conflict going on inside of them. The Judaizers were coming in and they were fanning the flame of that conflict and trying to use it really to protect their own selfish interests. And Paul's saying, forget all that. And the people that are trying to do that to you, I wish they would just emasculate themselves, because they're distracting you from Jesus and from the empowerment that Jesus has gifted you with in the Spirit. So there's this really deep dive you can do into all of that and what motivated them to do all that. But I think to answer your question, though, the conflict exists.
Good, thank you.
Yes, and all of us. The key, the first encouraging point, I think, is that is a marker that the Spirit is indwelling you. Because before you receive the Spirit at salvation, there was not that conflict to the same extent. Yeah. There may have been a moral conflict in people or in you before you came to faith, but it's not a conflict between the power of the flesh and the Spirit. It's a conflict between, man, I don't know if this is right or not. The conflict that now wages within you is, I think, even stronger, because the Spirit not only offers an alternative, the Spirit also offers power to choose the alternative. So where the power of the flesh is like, you got to do this in your own strength, and this is your only option, which leads to all those acts of the flesh that we see. The Spirit offers an alternative that's far more beautiful and far more holistic and far more healing, and not only provides that alternative in the moment, but then also empowers you to choose it, which is amazing. And that's why the conflict can rage so strongly inside of you.
Huh.
That's really good. And I mean, one of the things that you said, like the underlying component in all of that is that element of fear, right? And so if you're trying to pay attention sometimes to what's going on inside of you, that's a great question to ask. Like, based on how I'm feeling inside and this struggle, this internal conflict, what is it that I'm afraid of? Am I, retreating or feeling like I need to attack because I feel threatened and fearful about something? Or am I leaning into the power that I have through the Spirit to not have to be afraid because I can live free, right?
Yeah.
That's really good. As you guys are talking, I was thinking about, I had this kind of seminal moment with my oldest son, Jared, where it was clear he had done something that he shouldn't have done. And I confronted him on it as his dad. And I'll never forget him looking at me and saying, "It's not wrong if I don't get caught."
Right.
Right? So he's living with, there's no fear of anything other than getting caught. So he's just trying to avoid consequences. And so I remember as his dad going, well, when is like your conscience going to show up in the conversation, right? And if the Spirit and the flesh are incompatible, I'm as a dad, I'm wanting to see that show up in my kid. Nate, the other thing that you said the flesh, the way you said it really caught my attention. You said the flesh twists us inward, the Spirit untwists us outward, empowering us to overcome the flesh. So talk more about that.
Yeah, there's some early Christian theologians that talk a lot about sin or the power of the flesh, and that verbiage. I read a writer, and then as I researched what they were writing, it led back to like early theologians like Augustine, and there was this idea that sin twists us inward, and it's a never-ending cycle where we just continue to twist inward. And what that means is like we only look to our interests. We're self-obsessed. Like the acts of the flesh, that list, that is a list of self-obsessed, inner twisting things that impact not only you, but the people that you're in relationship with. So that imagery has really stuck with me for a long time now. And then in contrast to that, the work of the Spirit to then, as we have twisted inward, to untwist us back outward, where we're not self-obsessed. We're focused on who God is and the relationship that he desires with us, and our relationship not only to God, but to other people too. And it enables us, it empowers us to do what Dan talked about at the end of the message last week, that serving others humbly in love, just like Jesus. It's the Spirit's work of untwisting us outward that makes that possible. If not for the Spirit, that wouldn't happen. We would remain twisted inward. But that imagery has really helped me. And even in relational, specifically conflicts, that's one of the first things I do now to kind of check myself. I'm like, am I twisted inward on this? Or have I allowed the Spirit to untwist me outward? So like Dan's one of the specific things he talked about last week was believing the best instead of suspecting the worst. If you're twisted inward, you're immediately going to suspect the worst. If you're allowing the Spirit to untwist you outward, you're going to believe the best. So that's been a really good tool for me, especially in relationships with other people. It's, am I hearing them right? Did they hear me right? Do they have all the information that I have? Do I have all the information that they have? What ways is this communication complicated that I can be mindful of and be sensitive to, believing that, Jesus is working out the best in them just like he's doing in me. It's giving people the benefit of the doubt. But it's really helped me, that imagery.
That's really good. So this is probably where I should just pause and read the two lists, right? In verses 19 and 20, it's the acts of the flesh are obvious. Sexual immorality, impurity, debauchery, idolatry, and witchcraft, So as I read this list, I'm like, well, I don't do all those things.
Not all of them.
See, I referenced that, right? Like, oh, it doesn't apply to me.
Yeah, you did. You talked about it. Hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy, drunkenness, orgies, and the like. I warn you, as I did before, that those who live like this will not inherit the kingdom of God. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. So, Adam, you did this thing in your message where you used a bunch of loaded terms to kind of break that down, and it was super helpful. And I was typing furiously as you were talking, and I kept having to go back to capture it. But here's it was this: if you are or aren't, then you are.
Yeah.
Right. And you said if you are displaying love, joy, and peace, then your life will be marked by, it'll be harmonious and unified. If you aren't, you'll be hostile and divisive. Yep. So I'm not saying that you're better than the Apostle Paul at writing about this stuff, but these words really stuck with me, right?
And, I mean, come on. Did you notice they all started with H?
I did.
This was incredible.
Alliteration.
The way that
really
it worked
good.
out. It was incredible.
If you are, meaning the love, joy, and peace, your life will be harmonious and unified. If you aren't, it'll be hostile and divisive. If you are demonstrating patience, kindness, and goodness, your life will be hospitable and serving. If you aren't, you'll be hurried and ungracious. I love that. Then you said, if you are demonstrating faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, you will be humble and inviting, as opposed to being hypocritical and off-putting, right? Yeah. So if I take all those words and put them together, it's like the acts of the flesh are hostile, divisive, hurried, ungracious, hypocritical, and off-putting. Mm-hmm. That hits pretty close to home for me, but the fruits of the Spirit are harmonious, unified, hospitable, and serving, humble, and inviting.
Yeah, I wanted to put some additional handles on it because, like I said, sometimes we look at that acts of the sinful nature and it's like, oh, yeah, I might identify a few, but like some of those are on the pretty extreme end of things too. And so it can be easy to glance over that. And so, you know, what I wanted to do is, okay, look at those 9 attributes of the fruit of the Spirit and then what's kind of the opposite of that, but not just to go, you know, an opposite word, you know, 9 fruits of the Spirit, 9 opposites. And, you know, I read that, you know, some theologians like kind of broke the 9 down into 3 word sections. And so as I did that and just kind of sat with that, it's like, okay, what's the Spirit behind those things, right? And it was like, man, love, joy, and peace, that's harmonious, right? Patience, kindness, and goodness, like you're hospitable, you're serving others, you're inviting people in, treating them as a guest. And if you're faithful, gentle, and self-controlled, then you're going to be humble because you realize it's not all about you. You're being faithful to someone and something else. And there's gentleness and self-control in that. And so then to turn it around, and I think the handles on that become a lot more accessible for us when we're like, wow, like the opposite of the fruit of the Spirit is that hostility, that hurriedness. I have no time to listen to you or pay attention to, you know, where you're coming from. And hypocritical at its extreme, right? Yeah. Where we end up displaying things in our lives that are the exact opposite of who we're claiming to follow and how just dangerous and off-putting that is. And real quick on that, for me yesterday, probably one of the most incredible moments was after first service and a longtime Hopevale guy, you know, he's got life experience underneath him who I have a lot of respect for. He came up to me with tears in his eyes and was just like, thank you so much for that. Like, I needed that reminder to feed the Spirit, right? Yeah. Or to be led by the Spirit in my life. And I'm like, that's the beauty, because you can either walk away from that message feeling like, oh, I'm kind of beat down because I'm getting it wrong. And it's like, no, you're invited to be led by the Spirit in these areas. And I think that people who are most led by the Spirit in their lives, when we do that more and more, we realize how much farther we have to go to truly demonstrate the fruit of the Spirit. Like, when none of us arrive, none of us get to the point where we're like doing these things all the time, and that earthly internal conflict will be with us until we pass from this life, right?
Yeah.
But if you're following Jesus, like, how are you leaning into that to continually be led by the Spirit in humility and never come at it from that attitude of like, I've got this all figured out.
Yeah, so let's make this conversation immensely practical, right? The thing
Yeah.
you said in your message was, you asked the question, have we fed the sinful nature, or are we being led by the Spirit?
Mm-hmm.
What are things that we do that feed the sinful nature that's in us?
Kind of going back to that, like, are we driven by fear? I think that's a really, really important starting point, because once you start being led by fear, your behavior is going to lean towards the hostility, the hurriedness, and just that hypocritical nature, where you're probably coming at it from really good intentions, but your starting point was just wrong because it's coming from that posture of like fearfulness. And when you're afraid, it's like something's being taken away. You know, my viewpoint on how things are supposed to be, the way that they should be. Maybe it's like, you know, your own power in a situation. And if that stuff is starting to feel like it's getting taken away, you're going to get afraid. And when you get afraid, you lean into that us versus them, and then everything just kind of goes sideways. So that's how I think you can begin to feed the sinful nature.
Yeah, what would you add to that, bro?
I think anything we do divorced from the Spirit's leadership is feeding the flesh. So it's not hard to feed the flesh. It's basically anytime we're not focused on Jesus and what he's inviting us to do, we're feeding the flesh. But like on a really practical level, like information in is really important. So what are you feeding yourself? And what are you
As in, like,
consuming?
what are you watching on television? And
Yeah, like, what are you reading? What are you listening to? What are you consuming? If the things you're consuming are characterized by fear, you are going to be afraid. If the things that you're consuming are characterized by the acts of the flesh, you're going to reflect that. So I think that's a big key. I know I struggle, for instance, if I watch too much of the news.
Yeah.
The news is designed, we all know this, but we fail to remember it. The news is designed as a business, and that business is geared towards keeping you watching. The best way to keep people watching is negative stories. And if you can get people afraid, they will not turn the dial. So I know for me, if I find myself watching the news on a daily basis, I start getting anxious, and that works itself out. And that's a way that I've found, if I'm careful, I won't feed the flesh. And then I even seek out like news sources that are divorced from emotion, and it's just like, here are the facts, this is what's going on, there's no commentary to it, it's just, you know, here's the news, but without ulterior motives behind it to keep you watching it. That's one really, really practical way. And then there's people that I talk to in church too that are struggling with fear, they're struggling with anxiety, especially about what's happening externally in the world.
Yeah.
And I've gotten to where it's just part of what I counsel them is like, how many hours a day do you watch the news? Let's start by turning that off, and let's do that for a solid week, and let's see what the Spirit does in that space. But
another conversation I had with somebody in the lobby did have to do with news, right? And they're like, sometimes I just want to turn the television off so that I'm not exposed to it at all. And
then do it. Turn it off.
Yeah, and it's like, you do have that
Hopevale, you
ability.
have total permission to turn it off.
You heard it here. Turn off the news. By extension, lose your social media or tone down your social media. Go ahead.
I think there's a lot of wisdom at that. At the same time, though, sometimes I struggle with that, though, where like I also don't want to bury my head in the sand and pretend like these things don't happen. Like, I don't want to get ramped up and be fearful and overly emotional about what's happening that might lead me to a place of hostility, hurriedness, all of those things. But I also want to be aware. You think of Ukraine, right? It's like, I want to be aware of the atrocities happening there so that I know how to pray, but I am looking to the guidance of the Spirit of what are we called to in really, really difficult global circumstances.
But there's ways to get that
Right.
without having to have whatever your news channel of choice is running 24/7.
So Nate,
in the
what is your
background.
news channel of choice? Because I think I actually get that email indirectly because of you.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, actually, no. Like, if you want to really, really practical practice, there is a conservative news channel that I tune into when I tune in, and a liberal news channel that I
Sure.
tune into when I tune in. And what I like to do is to tune into both and get both perspectives.
Yes.
And knowing that there are extremes on both ends of it. So that's a super practical way to do it. There's also one that I've talked about with our staff that I really enjoy. It's an email newsletter called 1440. Thank you for reminding me about that, Adam.
Yeah, I'm on that mailing list.
Can
now.
you just
Yeah,
pause? I get a little credit here because Nate shared it
Paul.
with me, and I told Adam, it's
Boom.
like,
So-
you should get like a kickback.
Residuals, yeah. No, it's
Yeah.
really good. There's no commentary, or it's not an editorial newsletter, but it comes out every weekday morning, and it gives you from world events to economic stuff to political stuff to sports and entertainment.
Say, NCAA basketball, the Bears have been bounced.
It gives
That's
you the
right.
facts. It's just the facts. So you
That's
can
right.
know your head doesn't have to be buried in the sand.
Yes.
But then you don't have to get up in your feelings with a lot of spin on what the facts are.
And I read that in 5 minutes every day, and then
It's
it
great.
doesn't suck me in.
Yeah, that's why the language that you chose when you asked that question in your message, right? Like, are you feeding
Yep.
the flesh? Are you being led by the Spirit? That was super helpful. And if I look at the outcomes, or would people use words like harmonious and unified and hospitable and serving and humble and inviting to describe me, or would they use other words like hostile and divisive, hurried and ungracious, hypocritical and off-putting? So what I want to do is I want to take the last couple minutes of this conversation. I want to make it all about me. Okay.
You are the host.
Yeah. So
Was selfish one of them?
yeah. So there are a couple circumstances that I'm experiencing right now in real time that I think people will be able to relate to. And they're the types of things where I feel like I have these crossroads opportunities in front of me where I can almost choose to respond out of my flesh or in the Spirit, right? And so the first one, and I just want to run these by you and get some advice from you guys. The first is, those of you that know me know that my mother-in-law, Sue, is struggling with cancer. And it's been really difficult. And my wife, Bobby, has had to travel quite a bit to be with her mom as time is short. And so I have these moments where I sound and feel very serving and gracious and everything else. And I'll say things to Bobby like, go be with your mom. We'll be okay. I'll run the house. We'll keep things clean here and all that kind of stuff. Go be where you need to be. And then there are times where I do that, and then I start keeping score, or I start thinking thoughts like, I'm so just spiritual in how I'm handling this. She is so lucky to be married to me. How can I remind her of how lucky she is to be married to me? I have this built-in opportunity to love and serve my wife. How do when we find ourselves in circumstances like that, how do we do that without like polluting it with our tainted motives, our flesh infused motives?
Well, I think one of the things we talked about was we ended it by saying, like, looking at Dan's list of 3 things that he suggested,
Yeah.
those are all things we can do. How would they be different? Understanding you can do them versus understanding you've been empowered to do them.
Yeah.
So it's that thing of the Spirit not only presents the alternative to the flesh, but it also empowers you to choose the alternative. And then along with that, so how is that different? You can, extend beyond what's normal because it's an incredible time, and you can do more than would be expected. You can do those things in your own strength.
Right.
But what would that look like empowered by the Spirit? So I've got the kids, don't worry about it. I'll get them to and from school. I'll feed them this week. That's what you can do. What have you been empowered to do? If there is an unrelenting, unlimited power in you through the Holy Spirit, and there is, then what can you do? And then along with that, it's that the Spirit is working in concert with the Father and the Son. And the goal is always in their work. They never stop working, and they're always working to draw people near to the Father, always.
Mm-hmm.
So in this, as Bobby's mom goes through that, and her husband is a part of that, and Bobby and her family are all doing what they can, and they're witnessing this going on, your kids, everybody involved, it's asking the Spirit to empower you with the perspective of what the Spirit is at work doing in Bobby, in her mom, in her dad, in your kids. How is the Spirit in this situation drawing all of those people near to the Father?
That's
and
good.
Those are the things, whatever the Spirit's at work doing there, that's what the Spirit's empowering you to join in on doing, so that it's not only I can do this, but I'm empowered. And there may be specific ways the Spirit's going to use this to draw people towards the Father. So that'd be a good place to start.
That's really, really good. My next thing is, you both mentioned unreconciled or unreconcilable, appearing to be, what was the word used? Unable?
Yeah,
unreconcilable relationships. I have had one of those from our last church that Bobby and I were at. It's been a long, slow slog towards living in such a way that, as far as it depends on me, to be at peace and everything else. So I'm wondering what advice, when circumstances might say, hey, it's okay to be, it's okay to not be reconciled to that person. How do you lean into that?
There's a lot, I think, to say about that. One of the kind of angles that I would go at it was, that passage you brought up is what I would have pointed to, of like, as far as it depends on you. And so in so many cases, like, you really have to look at yourself and, what are the choices that you have to make, and what is, your best Spirit-led approach relationally in that situation.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes, like, depending on the circumstances and the relationship and the dynamics and what happened and all of that, you have to ask yourself, okay, how can I live at peace as far as it depends on me? But that also might not mean that you have to go out of your way to extend relationship to somebody else in a way that just gives them free rein back in, when they might not be reciprocating that same living at peace approach. And so it kind of leans into that question that I asked all of us, right? Like, where does the Spirit want to bring harmony in a strained relationship?
Yeah.
Through you, right? And so maybe the Spirit is laying something on your heart, like maybe there was still something left undone on your side to reach out to that person, to live at peace, to acknowledge maybe your own part in something, to explain to them how, something that they did, how that impacted you,
Right.
and put that out there and see if they're willing to take some ownership in it as well, where reconciliation can happen, right?
Yeah.
Reconciliation is not fully a one-way street, but if you're always hitting a one-way street, then I think to come to that place where you're like, hey, as far as it has depended on me, I can look at myself in the mirror and ask myself, is the Spirit wanting to do more through me in this situation, or have I done all I can and I can be at peace?
And that's
where the relationship is at.
And that's the only way that any of us, I think, can get to a place where we're not, there's not like the ball and chain holding us back in the...
Because again, otherwise that could twist you inward, where you're still taking some animosity towards that person and things like that end up, continuing to add to the strained relationship.
The only thing that makes a relationship unreconcilable is when two people are both twisted inward, right? So as far as it depends on you, is allowing the Spirit to untwist you outward.
Really
the other person may still be twisted inward, but at that point, it's not unreconcilable, right? You've done as much as you can to make it reconcilable, and then you allow the Spirit to lead you at that point to the extent to which you continue to reach out. But then your prayer becomes, Spirit untwist them, right? Yeah. And that's when the reconciliation can really happen, is when both have been untwisted outward by the Spirit.
And again, I mean, you can't change somebody else's approach or how they're going to, respond to what you can do. I think, again, that question for us, though, is if the Spirit is putting something on your heart that maybe there is still more that you can do to bring peace in that situation, then pay attention to that. And if the Spirit is leading you in that direction, then what are you called to do, right? You're called to walk.
It's really good.
Walk forward.
Yeah, you're right, and I don't like it. But
Scripture, man.
You're allowed to not like it.
Yeah. Okay, so here's our last scenario, and this one is probably the most dangerous, and Dan's out of town, and I'm hoping he's not listening to this podcast.
All right, strap in.
That's right. Dan and I were in a meeting last week with some representatives. So this is more like church-wide, with some representatives from the Saginaw County Right to Life. And we were having a conversation with them about the upcoming, it's Roe v. Wade is going to go before the Supreme Court. They're thinking sometime at the beginning of the summer, right? Mm-hmm. And what does that mean for us as a church? What does that mean for us as believers, as individual Christians? And I was really, in that moment, in that meeting, I felt a little bit of fear, to be honest, and definitely tension, because I know how some people in our church would like us to respond to the abortion issue, right? Something going on in our culture. Mm-hmm. That was such a unfeeling way to describe it, but you know what I mean. And then I know that the part that's twisted and complicated here is that Right to Life as an organization is also a PAC, a political action committee, right? And so I felt myself in the meeting trying to find a path towards how can we encourage individuals in our church to lean into an issue that we as Christians, as Christ followers, should care about, without also taking on some of the political stuff. And so it was a leadership conversation for me. And I'm just going to ask if either of you would have advice for me as a church leader in a circumstance like that. Because this is another one of those things where it's like, Adam, you talked about the different ways that the church, you said at the beginning of your message, we as a church can build really big walls around us to keep all the bad people out, or we can go to war, or we can assimilate ourselves and become just like the culture. And all three of those responses feel like a little bit of a flesh response. And so,
and I think one of the reasons that this topic gets, again, to use that twisted word, I mean, it just gets so twisted and kind of confusing for the best way to approach it, is because first and foremost, we do want to acknowledge just, I mean, the sinful, heartbreaking, thing that abortion is, that, we are against. We don't want to see that happening. But then that second question, okay, so what do we do about it? And I think over the years, that issue has become so twisted for believers to think that going about changing Roe v. Wade and all of these things, that is the best and only way, and we go to war for that, and we vilify the enemy. But it's like, what if we think about that issue from the standpoint of, the young, I'll just say young, the young unwed young woman who is finding herself in a situation where there's an unwanted pregnancy. And can our heart go out to her in a way that can show hospitality and humility and just graciousness to hopefully have the church wrap our arms around in love to somebody who's really struggling. So that would be my approach, and that's why I love so many of our groups have gone after this topic by partnering with organizations that are more compassionate in their extension of care to hopefully help people choose life. The only other question I would pose would be, if we have been set free from the law, why would we go so hard after just changing a law? Law does not change hearts or behavior. And so I am far less concerned about what laws are on the books as I am helping people make a good heart decision to choose life.
Loving and serving those people, right? What would you add to that, Nate? This is good because, like, I don't think I'm the one that's going to get in trouble for this conversation.
Hey, if I get in trouble for that, I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah.
No, I think we can all agree that abortion's wrong.
Yeah.
Flat out.
Yep.
But I think when you've sat down with someone and you've heard their story of, like a woman who's had an abortion and the guilt that then she carries through the rest of her life.
Yeah.
There is a way to fight for what is true and what is right with love. The acts of the flesh are all those terrible things. The fruit of the Spirit is love. Like, stop right there. It expresses itself in a lot of different ways, but the fruit of what the Spirit does is love. So if we want to address an issue, no matter what that political issue is, there is a way to address it in love.
Yeah.
And so if the way we're addressing the issue is full of hatefulness, if it's full of a judgmental attitude, if it's full of an unholy anger, if it's full of those things, it's not what the Spirit is doing. But there's a way to address these issues and to fight for what we believe is true. So like the right for life, there is a way to fight for that in love. Yeah. And it's characterized by not only what a law may or may not be, but what we can do to help in those situations. So it's families fostering, I mean, what more beautiful way to fight for life than to open your home to a child that needs a home?
Yeah.
That is fighting for life in love, being mindful of people that may have gone through that experience and they're carrying this guilt and this shame throughout the rest of their life. It's wrapping your arms around those people and loving them. There's so many ways that we can fight for what's right, and whether it's this specific issue or any other number of issues.
Right, because let's pull back from this specific issue and just talk in general, right?
Right. There's so many different ways, and there are places where we need to stand up for truth, but we can stand up for truth by loving, by being driven by the Spirit whose fruit is love. So if we are walking in step with the Spirit, the way Paul talks about it, what we do is going to be characterized by the fruit of the Spirit, and that fruit of the Spirit is love. So if it doesn't play out as love, we're not in step with the Spirit. We're in step with something we're trying to do. Yep. So it doesn't mean that you don't get passionate about an issue, that you don't, work toward and fight toward what is true. But man, if it's not characterized by love, you need to check yourself.
And real quick, so specifically with that issue, I mean, if we have any listeners who, have abortion in their background and history, and can't imagine how much you would just be struggling with the guilt and the shame of all of that, we are actually in the process of launching a support group specifically for women who have experience with this in their background.
Oh, wow.
And so
that's awesome.
I mentioned new groups coming up on May 1. So Bonnie is going to be leading a group that ministers to women who might have that in their history in that caring, compassionate, loving way. And so if you or anybody wants to go explore those conversations of healing together, you're more than invited to that group.
So that feels like loving well.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
And I will say that in this specific conversation that Dan and I were able to have with the Right to Life folks, some Hopevalers who were involved in Right to Life, they were loving well, and we were able to find some of those places, some resources and other things that we're actually going to be able to put in the hands of group leaders so that our people can be having good conversations as this issue promises to kind of bubble up in our culture over these next several months and everything else. I think we got through that. Thank you, guys.
If we get in trouble for anything, it's going to be going so far over time.
Yeah. It's been long. Well, that's what happens when two guys preach, right? You got two guys that need to take the deeper dive, and this has been really fun for me. I think I'm closer to agreeing with everything that you guys said yesterday, so that's awesome.
Our work here is done.
That's right. Thanks for joining me, and thank you everyone for listening in and checking out this podcast, and we're going to be back next Sunday, continuing through Galatians, so thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week when we take another deeper dive. Have a good one.
Thank you for watching the Deeper Dive video podcast. To check out our full library, make sure to subscribe by clicking the button below. Also make sure to select the bell icon in order to be notified of any new content as it is posted. If you would like to give to the Lord here at Hopevale and support the ministry, you can give by visiting hopevale.org/give. Thank you again for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you and your family at Hopevale Church.